Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Grantmakers for Education Conference. My name is Nicole Leach. I serve as head of education at the Deutsche Bank Americas Foundation, which is based in New York City. I have the honor of serving as a member of GFE's board of directors, and this year as a chair of the conference planning committee. As we start this new day all together, I reflect on the immersive listening and learning that took place for me yesterday. A lot of these reflections swirl around the dynamics of power and privilege. As grant makers, we need to confront that privilege, examine it within the context of our own personal identities, and understand whether we protect or subvert our privilege and how, and consider the ways in which we play out our power with others. Christina Wezo yesterday relayed a very poignant insight that we are the help, not the heroes, in other people's stories. And by telling their own stories, both Kevin Powell and Maria Hinojosa implored us not to impose our own cultural values on others, to ask ourselves how we relate to people and communities we serve, to engage in conversations with love, respect, and compassion, so we can authentically serve as helpers and as healers. And Anna Tilton, GFE's executive director, reminded us that etymologically, the word philanthropy means the love of humanity in the sense of caring, nourishing, developing, and enhancing what it means to be human. Altogether, we were called to understand the importance of listening to everyone's stories, particularly those whose voices aren't typically heard. And for me, the lesson is both good grant making and the road to education equity centers community, not ourselves as funders. So we kicked off the conference yesterday with the first day of incredible sessions, strong content and conversation. And I want to thank those who proposed sessions for the conference. There were more proposals submitted this year than we could accept. But I'd really like to thank and acknowledge and appreciate the conference planning committee. So if you wouldn't mind, all of you committee members standing up, this schedule of strong sessions did not happen by chance, and this committee, here, and among all of you, don't be shy. This committee parsed through many session proposals, ideas for site visits and performers to ensure that the conference would provide a high-quality experience that upholds the values of community empowerment and education equity. So thank you. On this new day, we must continue to confront our own power and privilege, interrogate our beliefs and our actions, and consider the ways in which we can better center community in our grant making. How can we help create the conditions for communities to stand in their own power? So this morning we'll hear from some collaborators in a new initiative that demonstrates the profound power of listening and being very connected to community. This collaborative aims to dramatically increase the probability of youth success, particularly for young people growing up in conditions of concentrated poverty. Each partner recognizes that they can't go it alone and show us the benefits of challenging ourselves to be open to the voices and ideas that empower communities and create sustainable change. Our guide this morning is Meredith Vieira. I presume we all know her work as an award-winning journalist and talk show host, but should you desire, you can open up your app and read her full bio. But in the meantime, please join me in welcoming Meredith to the stage.
One silly technical question. Do I have to turn on this microphone?
Okay. That's not hysterically, but okay. I've been told you are a friendly crowd and eager to learn, so I want to start out by saying that I am honored to be a part of the National Conference of Grantmakers for Education. To those of you in this room, I want to say thank you as well. Thank you for making it possible to transform the lives of children, especially vulnerable children in this country. In the short time we have this morning, and it really is a very limited amount of time, we're going to tell you about the important work that is being done in communities around this country to provide academic, social, emotional, health and financial supports to families and children who face daunting barriers to success, and there are literally millions of them. In a few minutes, you will meet our esteemed panelists whose work proves that lives can be changed through collaboration. You're going to hear that word repeatedly this morning, collaboration. It is the key word in this morning's discussion. Look, if you're in this room, you already know how difficult it can be for a young person trapped in the cycle of generational poverty to move along the pathway to a better life, not only graduating from high school, but aspiring for more than that, aspiring to go to college or other post-secondary institutions to create a personal and financial rewarding life for themselves and for their families. But all of you also know how difficult it is to get every stakeholder in the community to focus on accomplishing this goal. So how do we change that? What systems, structures, and initiatives are needed for schools, businesses, local philanthropy, faith-based organizations, parents, and students to be on the same page? It sounds daunting. How do we get them? How do you in this room, the national and local funders, align your efforts with these stakeholders? Again, I said it sounds impossible, but it can be accomplished and is right now transforming the lives of children in Buffalo, New York. It wasn't long ago that young people there felt they faced insurmountable barriers to success, that they had few options in life, no opportunities at all, no way out of poverty. Buffalo found a way to change that. And that is just an example of the power of communities to change the future for their kids. Now, I know that many of you in the room are familiar with Clotilde Dedecker and her passion and commitment to the children of Buffalo. She can't be with us today, but I think she really deserves a round of applause for all of her great work. We're about to get to our panel, but first I want to provide you with some context for our conversation. Richard V. Reeves is a senior fellow in economic studies and co-director of the Center on Children and Families at the Brookings Institution. Richard is going to share some of his findings on economic inequality and the obstacles to social mobility. And these findings are based in part on his research in Buffalo. He's also just been named one of the 50 most influential thinkers in America by Politico. I was not on that list. Richard, welcome. Congratulations, Marty.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith. Not bad for a Brit, eh? Well, thank you for mentioning the Politico 50 thing, which was just announced. I must say that in previous years, when Politico have announced this list of 50 most influential thinkers, I've always thought it was a stupid list, totally subjective, vapid, clickbait nonsense. But I must say, this year, I am British by background, but last October I became a US citizen. Thank you. This is the only country in the world where people applaud when you say that. But actually, on the last day that I needed to do so in order to be eligible to vote in the presidential election in Maryland, where I live, there were 47 people from 53 countries that day taking the oath. All of us marched straight over to the Women's League of Voters and registered to vote. It was a big deal for me, but I tell you what, it was a bigger deal for pretty much everybody else in that room, including the woman next to me in tears from Afghanistan holding her child. And so, for me, the promise of America, as Clotilde just said, is as strong as ever. It's the practice that we need to work on. And I've studied class and inequality in my old country and in my new country for a long time. And I am now coming to the end of an AIR, American Institutes of Research funded project on educational change, which is looking in particular at Say Yes as a case study for education reform. And I think my role here today is, as Meredith says, just give a quick bit of background. I work on intergenerational mobility. And I'm going to lead with some good news and some bad news and then a solution in my brief time. The good news is that post-secondary education, and in particular completion of a 2- or 4-year college degree, is hugely important for upward mobility. There's nothing quite like it for upward mobility. The bad news is so few people from poorer backgrounds get the opportunity to acquire those credentials and move on. And I'm going to say a little bit about what that means. So I'm going to have to be relatively brief, but as I'm a Brookings scholar, I can't travel without slides. You know, we have an existential crisis if we don't have a sort of chart. Is this going to work? How does this work? How do I advance this? Because there you go. So this is basically what I've already kind of said. Horace Mann said education is the great equalizer. Yes, that's true. George Carnevale at Georgetown says that higher education in the US is an engine of inequality. That's also true. It's not just what happens at college, it's in the years up to that. It's candidly human capital formation in the first 25 years of life. And that's become more important. In order to change this, focus and commitment are vital. And if I want to leave one thought with you, is this idea that without commitment, and therefore commitment devices, things that hold us to account, it's almost impossible to bring about change. So first of all, the good news, the great equalizer. Now, here's some charts. These are people who are born poor. Everybody you're going to see in the next few charts are born into the bottom 20% of the income distribution, the bottom quintile. That is roughly the same level as the federal poverty line. So no question about it. You can think of these people as poor. But where it's showing me is where they end up as adults in the income distribution based on their education. So this chart tells me if I'm born poor and I don't finish high school, I have more than a 50% chance of remaining poor. That's what that left-hand bar is telling you. More than a 50% chance that I will stay in poverty if I don't finish high school. Now, this is going back because it's intergenerational. This is people who've gone back a few decades. These numbers will have changed. But nonetheless, what it basically says is that if you're born poor and you don't finish high school, then to use a technical Brookings term, you're pretty much screwed in terms of the American dream, right? Now, let's see what happens if you finish high school. This is the next bar, purple. Things get quite a lot better. You're more likely to escape from poverty. Only 30% remain in poverty. Again, this is backward looking. And a number of people will make it to the top. You get a few, just over 10%, even make it to that top quintile. You move all the way up, Horatio Alger style, from the bottom to the top. So that's much better. Then see what happens if you complete college. These are people who complete a 4-year college degree. So we're very fond of saying in intergenerational mobility and poverty and inequality, we use the phrase a lot, there's no silver bullet. I bet you've all heard that phrase, haven't you? Right? It's one of the standard cliches that we use. And it remains true, but you know what? Getting a 4-year college degree, and to a somewhat lesser extent, a 2-year college qualification is the closest thing I can see. It's also one of the few things that seems, at least to be in theory, tractable, something we can do something about as policymakers, as communities. It's quite hard to shift some of the other dynamics around family formation, for example, or residential segregation, not that we shouldn't try. But if we can't change the story around education, then it seems to me we're in real trouble, and it will remain, to use Clotilde's phrase again, a promise, not a practice. So that's the great news. Poor kids can jump up the income distribution if they get education, and especially if they get college education. Now for some bad news. This is work from Biraj Chetty at the Equality of Opportunity Project. The leading project on intergenerational mobility in the US today is led by Raj and his team out of Stanford. This tells me, across the bottom, the income of the parents on the rank from 0 to 100. So poorest on the left to richest on the right. So I'm taking from the poorest families to the richest. And the vertical axis tells me what percentage of the kids from those families are going to college between the ages of 18 and 21. So this doesn't capture mature students, that's a big gap in this chart. But nonetheless, what's the relationship between your household income and your chances of going to college? That's what the plot shows. Now, that's what you call a correlation, okay? You know how sometimes social scientists put lots of splatter dots onto a chart, and then they put a line of best fit through it to say, look, there's a correlation. You're looking at it going, really? Is that really? They've put a line of best fit on this as well. You can see the line of best fit just behind all the other dots. There is an arithmetic, almost eerie correlation between the income of your parents and your chances of going to college. It is virtually mechanical in its relationship. And what that means is the charts you just saw, for the kids who do get to go to college and go away, there ain't very many of them doing it. So the big problem is not that post-secondary education will not change people's life chances, as long as it's of decent quality. It is that so few kids from poorer communities and poorer households get the chance to enjoy it. Education is therefore both the great equalizer in theory and the great stratifier in practice. And that is the fundamental paradox that faces American education today. Is it getting better, though? You'll hear a lot to say, well, we're getting lots and lots more poor kids coming. Same data from Chetty. This is the proportion of kids at different kinds of post-secondary institutions from the bottom 20% of the distribution, the poorest kids, over time since the year 2000. So this century, what has been the trend in the number of kids from poor backgrounds going to these different kinds of colleges, elites, Ivies, 4 years, etc.? It's flat, with one slight exception. For-profit colleges have slightly increased the number of kids from the poorest families that they're taking on. That, as many of you in this room will know, turns out to be a very mixed blessing for many of those. As far as the 4 years are concerned, as far as the elites are concerned, there has been no increase in the number of the poorest kids they're taking. Now, this is the bottom 20%, and so I'm very often challenged, and so is Raj and his team, when we present this data, because the Pell Grant eligibility cutoff goes above that 20%. You're picking up kids from outside that bottom quintile. And so it is perfectly possible that there are more lower-income kids from the next quintile up, still from low-income families, low-income households, but not the lowest income. So it might be true that those with really kind of very modest backgrounds, we've seen a slight increase, but we've not seen an increase from the very bottom, which, for my money, is where the real focus should be. So things aren't really getting better. This is slightly depressing, but I'm going to hopefully cheer things up a little bit. Oh no, I'm going to depress you a bit further first. One of the things that colleges will quite rightly say, that post-secondary institutions will say, well, look, what can we do? These are SAT scores by household income background in math and writing, the latest numbers from the College Board. Not quite the same income breaks, these are just the ones they use, but same poorest on the left to richest on the right. What you'll see again is a really very, very strong relationship between the income of the household that you grow up in and your SAT scores. And so there's a danger that what can happen is if you apply a purely and narrowly meritocratic approach to college admissions, then you can basically wash your hands and say, well, look, what can we do? You know, the poorer kids just aren't smart enough to get in. We'd love to let them in, they're just not good enough. It's the K-12 system that's the problem. And then the K-12, so then the high schools can say, well, it's true, but have you seen what happens in the middle schools? By the time they get to us, it's too late. And then the middle schools say, well, honestly, it's elementary school, you've got to start early. Then the elementary schools say, no, pre-K, that's the answer. And then the pre-K people say, no, 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 it's about home visiting. And then the home visitors throw their hands up in despair and say, you know, it's the parents. What can we do? And so it's basically like that game where, you know, do you play pass the parcel in the US? I should have asked this question before. There's this thing where you just keep passing the thing around and then when the music stops, right, it's a bit like that. Everybody's passing the parcel. Everybody's pointing at somebody else. And the truth is, it's a systemic problem. It's a community problem. And it takes everybody to do their bit. This is, in the end, nobody's fault, but everybody's responsibility. And that's a sort of systemic approach that's required, and that's a policy point. That's not a moral point, it's a policy point. You can't look at this and not think that it isn't everyone's responsibility, and you need to intervene at each and every stage in a sustained way if you're to do anything. That includes post-secondary education, but it doesn't restrict us to post-secondary education. So what does that mean? Well, one of the things that I have learned, and one of the things I'm working on in my project now, is that change is hard, and it takes a long time. I'm reminded of a quote from the political scientist Max Weber, who described politics famously as the slow and steady boring of hard boards. You know what? That's a bit what this kind of reform is like, the slow boring of hard boards. There is no magic moment. There is no magic trick. Slow and hard. But it has to be sustained. And we have to make it stick. There has to be a credible commitment to maintain an initiative rather than this today, that tomorrow, whatever the latest wheeze is politically or even philanthropically, is to sort of move it, is to stick with it. One thing is clear is that it's better to just to improve an existing and keep going and working at it and learning from it than it is just to tear something up and start all over again and again and again. So that means a credible commitment to change. A credible commitment, not a rhetorical one. Find me a politician in the US that won't say, I think college is important and we need more poor kids getting a better education to make America more prosperous and fair. Find me a politician who isn't willing to say that. It's therefore kind of irrelevant what they say. It's what they do that counts. And in particular, whether the commitment is binding. So I write a lot about Ulysses. I've written a thing called Ulysses Goes to Washington. Remember, he knew that he'd be tempted to steer the ship onto the rocks. So what did he do? He instructed his crew members to tie him to the mast. It's a pre-commitment device. It's the knowledge that there will be a new thing, that we will get tempted, there'll be a fiscal crisis, there'll be a change in leadership, there'll be something that will change, that will justify us giving up our commitment to doing something. And so let's find ways to pre-commit ourselves, our institutions, and our communities to making this change really work, because without commitment, it won't really happen. That requires commitment devices. That requires promises that are public. It requires institutions that lock us in. And so what that means is that the commitment you make in a community has to be public and it has to be real if it's to make a change. I'm struck that we very often nowadays talk about the need for stick-with-itness and grit and commitment among our students. We need to start asking it of ourselves as policymakers too. Thank you.
Well, that was certainly sobering, to say the very least. Obviously, the data paints a dire picture of the challenges faced by children in poverty, but no matter how daunting it seems, the obstacles can be removed, and the panelists you're about to meet have worked on this for years, and they are hopeful about the future. So I'm going to bring them up to the stage, please, starting with George Weiss, founder and chair of Say Yes to Education, Alma J. Powell, chair of America's Promise Alliance, Elaine Wynn, chair of Communities in Schools, and Mary Ann Schmitt-Carey, chief executive of Say Yes to Education, president of the Weiss Institute. It was a partnership between Say Yes to Education and America's Promise Alliance. And before we start, I just want to say one of the reasons that I wanted to be part of this panel this morning is because education in my family means a great deal. It was drilled into me. Both of my parents are first generation. They're Americans. Their parents came from the Azores. And my father's dad was actually a priest who ended up liking the ladies, and he left the priesthood. But because, that's a whole nother story, but because he was a priest in the Azores, he was one of the few people back then who could get an education. And so he understood the value, and when he left the priesthood, he actually started a newspaper, the first Portuguese-American newspaper in this country. And he drilled into his children the significance of an education in order to succeed. My father went on to Harvard and Harvard Medical. My aunt went on to Tufts and Tufts Medical. And my dad spent his life working as a general practitioner, but every evening would come home and just work and work and work. And when we would ask him, why don't you take a break, Dad? He said, because I want you guys to get a great education. And I was lucky that I did. And every Sunday night, we polished our shoes. And if we complained, my mother said, it's out of respect for that school that you're going to. So as a reporter, I have now witnessed what happens to kids who don't get a good education and how there's so much inequality in this country. I just was with Rory Kennedy. She did a documentary called The Digital Divide. And she looks at schools that are literally a few blocks away from each other. And in one school, you have a senior who has never been exposed to technology, so bright, a poor kid who's frightened out of her mind as to what she's going to face when she leaves that school, that she won't be able to succeed. And a few blocks away, there's a school where kids have the advantage of so much technology, and they say, you know what? We wouldn't have the same dreams if we didn't have this at our fingertips. And that's what we're dealing with in this country. So on that note, I'd like to get to our panel. George Weiss, first of all. He knows how powerful hope can be. George, over the past 30 years, has gone from personally helping 112 seventh graders in Philadelphia get on the path to college to now making it possible for entire communities to support tens of thousands of students on the same pathway to achievement as the children in Buffalo are experiencing right now. George, just to start, through your experience, what does it take to get a child, particularly a child in poverty, to college and beyond?
Firstly, let me comment about a couple of things that Richard mentioned. And one, I agree that the statistics are very sad indeed. And I also would like to tell him I think I was 51st on that list, and I think it's somewhere in there.
The list is bogus, we know that.
Just being facetious there, Richard. You know, Meredith, what I want to do is I want to change the dialogue just a little bit. I want to talk about waste and philanthropy. I want to talk about
waste and philanthropy.
Waste and philanthropy, especially in medical philanthropy. I did a talk show the other day where I stressed this, and I was talking to Michael Milken yesterday, in fact, when he talks about 54 breast cancer foundations in the United States. How is that efficient? Each having their own director, executive director, fundraising people, et cetera. Okay, you really need 3 or 4 to make a difference. When you look at Sean Parker and his gift of $250 million for cancer and cancer immunology, and he brought 6 academic centers together, and the carrot was a $35 million gift for research, but the conditions that you have to work together. That is transformative, and I really think that should be the theme, and I think it is the theme, to work together.
But how do you do that? Because there are thousands of programs out there that deal with education.
Well, yeah,
Students.
I'm still talking medicine. I still got 2
Oh, okay.
minutes
All
more
right.
on medicine. But when you look at donors, okay, to medicine, they give to their alma mater, to the local hospitals. They also give money as a grateful patient. How about who's doing the best research? Okay, and that's really the key to my view, is that there's a lot of waste. Okay, switching from, cancer, which is very, very, difficult and complex, to education and how do we work together. Education is not rocket science. In my view, okay, when you look at the people, and I think I'm going to be speaking about this in your next question, but when you look at the audience here, okay, you've got some, wonderful, wonderful foundations, all of, really, really genuine in the desire to make a difference. But you also have the power, you have the clout to pool your resources to force us to work together. So many people reinvent the wheel. Okay, as I said, it's not rocket science. Okay, what Say Yes is doing, what Alma and General Powell are doing, what my good friend Elaine Wynn is doing with CIS. We have to work together.
But everybody believes that what they're doing is the most important work.
The motives are pure. Okay, there's absolutely no motives are pure. But when you look at the educational component, we've been working at this for 30 years. Okay, and the success is there, the data is there. Okay, we can quantify our returns. One of the things that I think is really special about Say Yes, it's its holistic approach. Okay, and just briefly, the things that we provide from free mental health clinics in every school, the social workers, and on and on and on and on. But then a very key component is we have 103 private colleges that stand with us to offer our kids free tuition. Okay, and that is tremendous, because what it does is it raises hope. And hope is really the key word that I think Richard mentioned in his opening comments. Hope is so important. It's about raising, expectations. And these colleges include all the Ivies, Stanford, USC, Notre Dame, Georgetown, wonderful schools, and it just raises the expectations. How can we work together? Alma and General Powell, America's Promises. We join forces. Our goal is to, right now we have roughly 130,000 kids. By next fall, we're expecting to be at 170,000 kids. Our goal is to hit 1 million kids
But what
a year.
what convinced you, George, that collaboration was the way to go?
Because I'm a businessman, okay, and I look at a businessman. I'm 74 years of age, and I say to myself, is 130 kids enough? 130,000 kids enough? And the answer is it's not. Okay, there's so many wonderful kids that are just falling off the cliff every year. Everybody in this new room knows that these are wonderful young boys and girls. The playing field isn't level. So the question is, if you want to achieve a goal of 1 million kids a year, how do you do it? You can't do it alone. My ex-wife thinks I have an infinite supply of resources, but I don't. And
So how do the people in this room help you make the difference?
Basically, you have, as I said, you have the power, you have the resources, okay, to put aside. And what I loved about, Alma and General Powell is none of us approach this joint venture with egos. We put aside our egos to say, how can we make a greater difference in this world? Okay, and that's what everybody here has the power to do. Okay, there's so many great programs out there, whether they're after-school programs, mentoring programs, but there's probably 100 mentoring programs. Why do we need 100 mentoring programs? Okay, why not take something that works? That's what business is doing. That's the world is doing. Okay, they're copying the things that the U.S. has done well. Whether they're getting them covertly or not is another story. But as a businessman, you look to see what's working, what's not working, and get people to work together.
But when you've tried to do that, have you had people push back?
I'm a 7th degree black belt, so I don't get a lot of that.
But seriously. Or I should move away from you, actually. You could hurt me.
Basically, this is really a new venture that we've just started. So I can't say that, we've had a lot of pushback, but the people have to just buy into the dream. That's really what they have to do. When you look, there was a research report done about 1.5 years ago, and they said that the CIS, which is Elaine's charity, Communities and Schools, and Say Yes are the answer to inner city education. Because what we're doing is providing additive services to the kids, the same services that you would provide for your own kids. And, frankly, I was asked by the White House to speak in California about increasing accessibility for minors to go to college. And so there were 4 people from the White House in the front row, and I said, firstly, what I'd do is I'd throw at all the politicians, which went over really well. I don't think I'll be invited back. But it's true, if you look at every government legislation that's come through, has it helped our kids? And I contend it has not. I was an advisor to the senior President Bush almost 20 years ago, and I can honestly say K through 12 today is no better than it was 20 years ago, Meredith.
Well, that's a very depressing statement.
Richard, would you concur?
The gaps have gotten any narrower.
They have not gotten any narrower. No. So obviously something has to be done. That's clear. That whatever we're doing now is not working. I want to bring in Alma Powell and America's Promise Alliance, and toot your horn for a second here. It grew out of a presidential summit 20 years ago attended by then President Bill Clinton, along with former Presidents George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, and Nancy Reagan representing her husband. And they call for the nation to come together to make the future of children and youth a national priority. The Alliance unites more than 450 national organizations, thousands of community leaders around the goal of improving the lives of young people. And its founding chair was retired General Colin L. Powell, and he was succeeded in that role by his wife, Alma, who has led this effort for the past 15 years. Alma, first of all, why did you embark on this work, and how have you changed your strategy? How has the Alliance changed its strategy?
Well, we have always known that the lives of our young people are very important. And it is very important for us as individuals and as groups of people to provide the supports that young people need for success. The thing we have to keep in mind is they are the future. And if they are not prepared for the future, what is our future? And that becomes more crucial every year as we go along with more and more challenges that young people have to face, the disparities that exist in education and other activities, the gaps that you talk about. So America's Promise is dedicated to improving the lives of young people. After that summit, at the summit 20 years ago, thousands of people came together, corporations, individuals, governments, and they started talking about what it is that young people need. And we discovered it's not rocket science. They need 5 basic things in their lives: a caring adult, a healthy start, safe places to learn and grow outside of school, a marketable skill through an effective education, and a chance to give back. And that is the basis, that is the bedrock of America's Promise Alliance. We know that things cannot be accomplished solely with individuals. It takes a village. And the bigger that village is, working together, the better results we will have. Over the years, we have tackled a number of problems, and with the work that we have done, we can say to you that today the American graduation rate is higher than it has been in history. We began a campaign called the Grad Nation. We held 250 summits in 50 cities, bringing communities together to talk about how they can be sure that their young people graduate. When we started the campaign, the graduation rate in the United States was 70%, and 50% of African Americans and Hispanics did not graduate. Today, the graduation rate in the United States is 83.2%. And we like to think, and we know, that this is a result of bringing communities together around the young people. Our aim is to have the graduation rate reach 90% by the year 2020. But then we need to say yes to help these young people move on and into college. We need the collaboration of communities to make a difference. Through our work over the past 20 years, the teen pregnancy rate is down. The use of alcohol and drugs is down among young people. And we have the proof in the graduation
You've
rate.
talked about calling for a no-labels platform to support collaboration between foundations and nonprofit providers and committed communities. What do you mean by that, and how would it work?
Well, it's what we are. We are an alliance of organizations around this country. Those 450 partners that you talk about are representative of all of society working together for young people. And we talk about people being in their silos. George talked about all the different cancer foundations. The purpose of our alliance is to be a convener of people so that everybody is on the same page and not in their own little silos working on the same things. You have much more success with everybody working together, and that's what we talk about.
But was joining forces with Say Yes to Education a strategic decision?
Oh, yes, for them and for us.
In what way?
Well, we recognize that we both are in the same business, but with different levels of participation. And we know that together we can make a bigger difference in the lives of young people. It was very exciting to join forces with George and have him become a partner of the Say Yes Foundation, become a partner with America's Promise. And I expect that we will be seeing great things. Along with the other things we do with programs in communities, we also have a center for research called the Center for Promise that deals with the problems that young people have in real time. And they have done studies with young people, talking to them, asking them. The first study was called Don't Call Them Dropouts. They said, don't call us dropouts. That means we're failures. You have to understand what it is in our lives that keep us from going to school. And the reasons are myriad. You just would not believe some of the things that young people face that keep them from going to school. And the second study is entitled Don't Quit on Me. And that is a challenge to all of us to stick with it. I talked to one gentleman who said, oh yeah, I got a little time. I could mentor somebody. I said, don't start if you're not going to stay. They have to know that they have someone has their back. This past weekend, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting does this every year called American Graduate, Make It Happen. And the theme this year was mentorship. Almost all of the programs that were highlighted in that program on Saturday are partners of America's Promise, working together in the lives of young people in different ways, some of them with STEM programs, some of them with athletics, but always with those caring adults there to have the backs of those young people and to give them hope and promise that they can move forward.
And to stay there, as Richard said, pre-commitment.
And to stay
there. Right.
You have to stay there.
And it certainly takes a village, which brings us to our next panelist here. The gains in Buffalo that you saw in the video would not have been possible without the scaling of academic and non-academic support services, not only for young people in the schools, but also for their families. The importance of these types of supports is at the core of the philosophy of communities in schools. For 40 years, it has built upon community relationships to empower students to succeed inside and outside of the classroom. Elaine Wynn is the chair of this impressive organization. Elaine, thanks for being part of the panel. Why do you think these comprehensive supports are so critical in terms of a child's abilities to succeed?
Well, just as my colleague kind of pivoted off your question, if you don't mind, I'm going to
Sure.
pivot a bit as well,
Sure.
because I can't ignore the comments that we've heard before I began. And I love, respect, and admire my colleagues on the stage, but I would suggest I have a little different attitude about this is rocket science.
Why do you say that?
This is rocket science. I would say it, and perhaps because my immersion goes a bit longer, but I think this is very hard work. We have theorems, and we have ideas, and we have best practices, and despite that, we do not have liftoff. And I think that we have to acknowledge really the complexity of this issue and how interrelated all of the parts are in solving the problem. And I would maintain that this issue about equity and education in America is as complicated as healthcare. And it has not really gotten the attention that it broadly deserves.
Why not?
Because most people think that their kids are getting a good education. And so the people who are in decision-making positions and policymakers, their kids are going to school and it seems as though they're doing just fine. And so of course, for you to get outside your comfort zone and really dedicate yourself to all the rest of the kids is a departure from what our normal activity is. You would think that that is the occupation of philanthropy, but philanthropy alone can't solve the problem. I think the philanthropy part of it is just part of a leveraging, pressuring mechanism that people like George bring to this. And you can see he's irreverent. We need that irreverence that says, don't give us these statistics. They don't really mean anything. We know what we know. Now, it's true our graduation rate is improving, but I'm on the State Board of Education in Nevada. A lot of our kids are graduating. They are not college and career ready. And so they graduate, but what does that really mean? They're graduating into a world that is more complex. We're expecting them to know higher level skills. So the dynamic evolves over the years that we've been doing this work. But the good news is that the enlightened notion that treating children and families holistically has finally gained traction, and that is absolutely at the root of what Communities in Schools does. We have been a commitment device, and our founder, Bill Milliken, was prescient in his idea about understanding it's not just the internal institutions of education that deserve to be focused on, it's the condition of that child when he and she arrives at the school, and how are they open and receptive to learning if they are distracted by violence, poor health care, just having their basic needs unmet. It's like, yes, we'll go to algebra today, but my dad just went off to jail.
Right.
You know, I mean, it is a disconnect that people don't realize exists. So the good news, I say, because of all of this effort, is that we are starting to understand what it's going to take, and it is going to be capacity building and sustainability. Hence, the value and importance of everybody in this room, who I thank immensely for considering this as part of your grant-making effort. You couldn't find a better cause. But in our own organization, we've been challenged. We have a new president who is here, Dale Urquiaga. Our staff challenges our board. What do you want to do going forward? Do we want to go broader? Do we want to go deeper? And it made us realize we only serve 1.5 million kids now, which is quite a lot in 25 states and the DC, but there are 13 million kids that need our services. We did the math. It's not possible for CIS to impact all those kids, but how we impact the kids we do impact is possible to expand and extend if we can work collaboratively. And the way we do that is what's known now as systems change, which is the hot topic. There was a paper done by the Stanford Social Innovation Group by Jeffrey Walker that's turning everything upside down and saying exactly what George said. It's wasteful to keep reintroducing efforts everywhere. We have to find out where are those places that are doing best practices, what are the strands of the problems they're trying to solve, consistent with some of the problems we're trying to solve. If absenteeism and truancy is an issue in a school district, CIS is your guy. You know, we can bring training and expertise and evidence to show how that can be addressed. So I think it's going to require a much more strategic, thoughtful, incisive way that we do business in the future. We have a new plan, the new strategic plan, but it's based on this constant evaluation and testing, driving policy, understanding every year, is the problem still the same? What are we trying to accomplish? How are we going to accomplish it in the best way possible? And examining, maybe we're not doing it well enough, so who is, and how do we leverage the things we know we do well with other people and the things they do well, and combine it in some fashion. So the thrust for us, we're in an ecosystem. You know, that's the key word now. Everything is an ecosystem. We have been one from day one, and we have acknowledged that we get all of the agencies and organizations and communities that take care of problems, food banks, medical assistance, Meals on Wheels, clothes closets, and we leverage those services at school sites with wonderful, loving, nurturing people who get connected to these children and develop strong personal relationships. That's the secret sauce of CIS, is not just being a program analyst and trying to schedule a day and the kid goes here and after school and here. That happens in consultation with the schools themselves and the individuals who are there that are CIS personnel that care about that child, care about that family, and care about that community. And the whole exercise winds up building the community. They do take responsibility.
Yeah, George, I know you wanted to say something.
I just want to interject something. And I'm a great supporter of Elaine, and I love what CIS has done for these 40 years. As you said, you bring all these services together. CIS for 30 years has the educational component. Why don't you and Dale consider joining forces with Alma and us?
We are there already.
We're in.
We are.
Schools is one of our founding partners.
We are absolutely there already. The reason that I fell in love with George is because I heard about what he was doing, and I said, oh, we're like-minded. Now, some might say we were operating in silos. Not really. No. We were observing each other's activity, and then we started to come together, and our teams would meet, and we would use very, very often the same education consultants. So we started to create a universe that could overlap. But I think what's happening now is even a greater challenge because we're talking about penetration across the country, not just in urban areas, in rural areas as well. And people don't think about that, and we've got to think about that. And also this very, very important business of racial equity and justice, that is part of our program.
But you know, if I'm a grant maker sitting out there, so much of what you've said is very positive, but you also said we haven't achieved liftoff yet after decades of working in the field. So it's almost like I'm throwing my money into a bottomless pit.
Let me just say this. How much is one life worth? How much is one life worth? If we all thought that we couldn't move the needle, I think as a humanitarian, that would be a very bad notion to consider. And maybe we look at this as we're holding the tide. You know, maybe we've built a dike and that it could be much worse if we weren't out there. But while we're doing it, we are becoming more enlightened. So I see this as an ongoing experiment, and it is bearing fruit. We are having language in policy now that is very descriptive about supporting evidence-based, successful programs as it relates to federal funds so that we now can braid some of this funding, because that's key. We've never been able to consider taking public money and private money and grants and braid them all together. But each part of that should be part of a sustainability effort. So I don't think we've wasted our time. I just think it's taken us a doggone long time to figure it out.
I want to bring in Marianne Schmitt-Carey. The Weiss Institute's goal is to expand the capacity of communities to make it possible for all young people to earn a college degree or post-secondary credential. Each of our panelists has expressed a desire to work together to ensure more students are supported academically, socially, financially on a pathway to success. All sounds good, but how do we get there, Marianne?
Easy question. Thank you, Meredith, for facilitating this conversation, and really honored to be with these national leaders. A couple things. I just want to pivot off of whether or not it's rocket science, and I think a way to frame that is that I think when folks say it's not rocket science, I think they're really speaking to just the common sense nature of how to support children in their development from prenatal to degree completion, to job placement, to productive citizenship. And I think the more we as a community can talk about the fact that this is not mysterious. It's very practical academic social health supports, it's acknowledging the impact of trauma, and it's creating those kinds of personal relationships so young people are nurtured so they can learn, quite frankly, how to believe in themselves, and so that they can be supported along this path. And so when they fall down, people pick them up, brush them off, and keep them moving towards a long-term goal. So the piece that isn't rocket science, particularly from the perspective of a mom, is we kind of know that. And some days it's more important to focus on the social emotional nurturing, and some days it's important to get them a tutor. It's always important to get them to the dentist and the doctor. And when something's diagnosed, it's really important to treat. So that's the piece that I don't think is rocket science. What really is rocket science, and it's been underinvested in, is how do you create the conditions within communities in order to do that consistently? And the reality and the common theme in the panel has really been about these very common sense, practical intervention supports that really does enable young people to achieve their potential. But for children and families that are growing up in conditions of concentrated poverty, as has been pointed out by everybody in the panel, or live in communities where institutionalized racism persists, that's where you're seeing unequal opportunity to have access to those common sense, practical supports. So I think that's a piece of really what we're talking about. And what George speaks of hope, I think that's really important too. For young people in communities that have ended up in conditions that feel hopeless, it's really hard to successfully progress. And I think if you spend time in Buffalo, that's a community that really has made the transition from, and local leaders would say this, hopelessness to hopeful, and getting coordinated, organized to provide those supports for young people. So how do you do that? I think the spirit of collaboration is a huge piece of what you need to do. But I also think that we need, as a community, to recognize that just looking at the last few decades, there's been tremendous investment in the development of programs in this country. And I'll say that I contributed to that. I was president of New American Schools. It was a business-led early venture capital effort to create more innovative programs for young people that could propel them to success. Several other national venture capital initiatives have happened in the last 20 years, and it's created innovations. There's no doubt about that. But the creation of the supply of those programs, I would say it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I think a lot of philanthropy is focused on that. And I think we need to figure out how to balance that, what I would call a supply-side strategy, with more of a demand-side strategy. We have to create the community conditions, the commitment, the capacity to organize, to deliver these supports through the full developmental trajectory of young people.
How do you do that?
Well, first of all, you shift the focus to how you create within the community. Let's actually go to a slide that just talks about how to differentiate the strategies of the past to what we're talking about. I'll just take a couple of minutes on that. In this slide, we've had discussions about this idea of silver bullets. And I think that that perpetuates the notion, even though there's amazingly positive intent, that there is some kind of technical solution that can fix what ails public education and can address the conditions of inequity in America. And the reality, what we've been talking about, is access to these types of practical programs, access to social capital, access to community commitment and belief in the capacity of young people that maybe start school and don't present as quote unquote smart at the beginning, that real belief that they can accomplish great things. So a shift from this idea of silver bullets to comprehensive supports. And that requires that within communities we start to build the connective tissue in order to have more strategic handoffs from early childhood to K-12 to higher ed to the world of work. It requires that we think differently about, we get out of our silos. Right now, a lot of our work gets stuck in an individual silo, whether it's a school system, city, county, private philanthropy. The reality is you need to aggregate the assets and the capacity across those silos to be able to scale and sustain the level of academic, social, and health supports that young people need to thrive. I also think that too often we're looking to find that superhero, whether it's a principal or superintendent, an individual mayor. And what we've learned is to do this kind of comprehensive work over a 25-year trajectory that Richard spoke to, and that others on the panel have talked about. You have to have a whole community of heroes. That shared responsibility. We have to move from blame game to shared accountability and responsibility and the provision of these comprehensive supports. I also think that a lot of the focus on short-term grants, that's leading to the churn at the local level. So you have effective, whether it's an after-school program or a summer camp or a tutor or a mentoring program, it's available for as many years as that short-term grant is in place and for as many kids as that grant will pay for. A key strategic shift in this work is partnering with whole communities and creating a sustainable financial plan that through the core operating budget of city and county and school system and with the leverage capital of private philanthropy, you hold constant those programs that make a difference, prenatal to productive citizenship, and really think about philanthropic investment to be the catalyst, philanthropic investment to actually create the conditions within communities, to have common metrics, to have data approaches, to see are we hitting developmental benchmarks for kids every step of the way. Philanthropy hasn't tended to focus on that, but needs to. And the final strategic shift, we've got to move away from this zero-sum game between early childhood, K-12, higher ed. You need all of it. So we have to find different ways to get that work done.
You've actually talked, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. And you've said to me before that you have the equivalent basically of the Paris Accord, but in education. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that?
So what Say Yes to Education has been focusing on over the last decade, we saw that there are so many assets within an individual community. Sometimes there are gaps. Sometimes there are needs that children have, and there isn't available good programming at the local community level. And that's a perfect time for national partners to be able to contribute to that local community. The problem is that what we found is that because there hasn't been sufficient focus on creating the community conditions to absorb innovation, to scale innovation, to sustainably fund innovation, that piece has been missing. So we strategized and talked about we really need to create the equivalent of the power strip within a community that you can plug in and get to that alignment from early childhood to college transition types of programs, but also create the ability of communities to really sort out what they need, to do the kind of analytics to see who's on the path, who's progressing successfully, who isn't, to really come together around a commitment to a common set of outcome objectives and to stick with it. That kind of commitment device that Richard's talking about. Continuous improvement needs to be the focus of a community versus finger pointing and blame game. So some of the elements of that power strip is really getting the whole community to agree to a common set of outcome metrics, a transparent data approach, to really learn how to think differently about governance. Because right now you have governance structure of city government, county government, school system. We need to do some silo busting and really create common table where you're actually planning together. The comments that Elaine was making about braiding of government and private sector dollars, it needs to be a co-investment strategy rather than a lot of sort of competing initiatives, because it's only in creating the synergy between those that allows you to align the kind of work that supports and nurtures kids through the whole developmental path.
But again, I mean, there are competitive interests out there. How do you convince them to come together? And if we've seen anything from the Paris Accord, sometimes people pull out.
So if I could address that for a second, this notion of a power strip, I think, is a powerful visual. And although we're talking about it in your case with the different areas of a child's progression educationally, when you do impactful collaborations, people that buy in bring with them an element of power. The care and feeding of the powerful is difficult. You can have a great program if the superintendent of your school district leaves. All of a sudden, you start all over again, building relationships and getting the collaboration back in harmony. So to the extent that you try to have an equal buy-in, the value of leadership is so critical. It's who is that person in that community? Who is it that's taking on this mission in a proprietary way that you can look to, that you know has the skill and the capacity to bring these players together and say, this is in our mutual best interest? And in the absence of that kind of enlightened leadership, and that can come from anywhere. It can come from the private sector. It can be a governor. It could be the person that's heading a local agency that deals with these issues day to day and says, okay, I've had enough. We've got to bring ourselves together and get organized. But the leadership is key.
And if I could just jump in on that in terms of how you create conditions, completely agree with your comment. Part of the shift that needs to take place is moving from thinking that there are sort of top-down programmatic solutions. Federal and state governments sometimes perpetuate that kind of activity, to really supporting and nurturing the bottom-up continuous improvement system that is focused on kids hitting developmental benchmarks. And one of the things that everybody on this stage and the organizations that you represent has recognized is that in each community, you really have to create the ability to have sort of a neutral facilitator. Some might refer to it as an honest broker that really has kids at the center of that focal point for all of the work. In Buffalo, that's what they've done. The community has committed to getting every child to a post-secondary degree. The commitment device that has been put in place is there is a board of directors for a scholarship program. Kids in Buffalo can go to any public university in New York State or any of the over 100 private universities tied to our compact. But that governance structure, that board, only will provide the scholarships for as long as the city leadership and the county leadership, the local nonprofits, the philanthropic community stay committed to providing the academic, social, and health supports. And if that stops because there's a leadership change, that board will temporarily suspend scholarships. So this has been in operation now for over 6 years. We've had 7 superintendents. And there have been, in those transitions, people that have pulled back from data transparency. We can't afford to do after-school programs. A myriad of things have happened. The leaders, the corporate leaders and philanthropic leaders sitting on that board of directors have said, we will not run a middle-class scholarship program, and that's all it is if you don't do your part. They've been quiet conversations. They haven't ended up on the front page of the newspaper, but it's actually kept people committed to the practical programs kids need. And as a result, 7 superintendent transitions, 17-point increase for children of color in terms of succeeding in high school, and 10-point increases in matriculating to higher ed campuses. So you can create a different way to operate within a community that enables us to overcome predictable, we know leadership's going to change. We just can't allow that to be the tail that wags the dog. We need to stay focused on the kids and the practical programs that get the results that all of us know kids are capable of.
Alma, I know you wanted to say something.
I do. I want to bring to you a real world, down-to-earth solution that is going on today. America's Promise partnered with a group of people who were interested in transforming their community. Ward 7 is the poorest ward in the Washington area. There are some 3,000 people in that ward. 90% of the households are single-parent households. Most of them are not educated, and only 30% of them are working. Pretty desperate community. It is isolated because there's only one road in and one road out. It's bound on one side by a deserted power plant, and on the other side by the Kenilworth Gardens. We began 5 years ago to create a promised neighborhood. The last administration said we want to create promised neighborhoods around the country. They had a competition for funds for this. We won a grant from the Department of Education. In that community, there's an early childhood care center, beautiful state-of-the-art center built by Educare, which came in and said, we would like to have a footprint here in this area. They take in children 6 weeks old to kindergarten age, and it's free to the community. A builder who was interested in being a part of this built a high-rise senior citizens building, which is right across the street from the Early Childhood Center, and those older people helped mentor those babies across the street. We brought in a health van to provide health care for the children, a dental van to provide dental care for the children. Another nonprofit built a freestanding health clinic for the entire community. And in the process, you had community meetings that gave them ownership of this community, so they are all working on the same page. They have a professional staff, a director who comes from within the community, who knows the community, and helps to develop the programs that are supporting the young people there. They call their promise America's Promise for 2 generations because the parents need the help too. And so they have programs in parenting and programs for mothers to be able to participate with their children and learn how to work with them. This is one example of providing the 5 promises in one small area. They're about to build, the same builder who was instrumental in doing the senior citizens building, is about to build a continuing education center right in this same footprint. And so these people have come together and they feel like a community, and as a community, they're making a difference in the lives of their children. And that is the kind of efforts that we need. We need the philanthropy to help keep it going, but we need the participation of everybody in the community, and it does make a difference.
You mentioned philanthropy. I mean, this whole gathering this morning is really a call to action.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love each of you to say to these folks, what can they do to help you on this mission, and how do they take philanthropy to the next step? In a perfect world, what would you hope they get out of this?
George, you can take that.
I'll take a shot at that. The interesting thing about it is, as Elaine said, this is a wonderful group out here. And really, what's interesting and what has to happen, and I think all of us in this panel spent a lot of time, talking to different conferences. The question is, what happens after one leaves?
Right.
Okay, so if it's just a nice presentation, people get excited. The question, what is the follow through? Okay, and that's the challenge for the people out here. The gauntlet has been thrown. The question is, you have committees, you have subcommittees, and there will hopefully be people of the same mind that want to work together And as we said, we don't need 100 mentoring programs. You don't need 100 after-school programs. As Elaine said, what they do is all these great services and bringing these services to the community and coordinating them. Say Yes has a great educational program that is successful. So that's the challenge, I think, to the group is we're willing to listen. And Elaine, I believe, feels the same way. I know Alma, and I know Marianne feels the same way. That's the challenge for the group. Run with this ball and make something happen for our kids.
I like to put my business hat on when we talk about this, because for me, it's always about value investing. I would prefer to invest in a company that has a proven track record, that has a clear direction, and is easy to understand, and is accountable. And I once said on Good Morning Joe that if CIS were a stock, I'd be buying. So that's my crass sales pitch. But having said that, it is incumbent upon us to follow up after today to find all of you. And we are more than ready and prepared to come and meet and present our programs and what it is we're hoping to do and intend to do, and get involved in some creative marketing approach with you and see if you believe in us or in a combination of efforts. But I think there's responsibility everywhere in this area. You all have to be accountable to the groups that you represent, but certainly I think you've heard the one message today, that everyone has wonderful intentions, hopefully. Lots of interesting programs exist. Innovations that should be considered, that are just fresh and new, that maybe have no track record, that deserve consideration. But in terms of making progress, go with organizations that are demonstrating results. And instead of making them these one-time shots, as they continue to perform and they meet the targets and the benchmarks that you establish, you should keep reinvesting. Because this is like being a political leader. You prove your case, you go to work, you do your job, and then you have to beg for money. It's kind of a weird situation to be in. And nevertheless, that's how it feels in the nonprofit world.
And how do they hold your feet to the fire to make sure that you all are
Pardon?
doing? How do they hold your feet to the fire, these people that are investing?
Well, we have our own internal goals and measures that we will share with everybody. How many more kids do we hope to serve, and in what areas and how? And we have a return on investment document that shows for every dollar invested, what kind of return do you get in terms of having kids not be on social needs lists and being taxpayers. We've already gone the distance to create those documents because we know everybody's sophisticated now. And in this competitive environment, they can only invest so much in certain areas, and we need to explain and to demonstrate that we deliver.
Marianne?
Ms. Val, did you want to jump in or?
Nope, I'll pass to you.
So, in the 3 decades that I've been involved in this work, I've worked in government, in the private sector, nonprofit, and now in philanthropy. The one thing that has been striking to me is how many great organizations are out there, but never finding that synergistic connection between them. And I think that is a huge part of what the challenge and opportunity that we have before us. Over the last year, our organizations, my colleagues that run your organizations, we've been in a conversation around how can we get to more of a unifying vision in this country. This idea of a no labels approach I think is really important. And how do we shift the focus to really looking at creating a network of cities across America that make a pledge and a commitment to supporting all children. So equity at the core of this, but having a pragmatic approach to how do we scale and sustainably fund the academic, social, and health supports that enable kids to reach their full potential. We have been interacting with the Brookings folks, Richard's colleague, Bruce Katz, who's really kind of the metro guru, and having a conversation about the need for these answers and solutions and for leadership to step up needs to be out in the field, particularly at this moment in time where there is an absence of leadership for the most part at the national level. We need local leaders to step up. And we have to think about how to reorganize our community, the foundations and the nonprofits that we support, to be able to work in much more integrated, coherent ways in real cities, whether it's Newark or Denver or Buffalo. And I think that's a big strategic shift. We have been talking about this as a children's accord, because again, shifting from kind of programs as the answer to how do we support kids along the developmental continuum. And we really envision this as a city-driven national campaign for economic inclusion, and that will increase the ability of all children to make it to the middle class by middle age. It's kind of a simple concept, but everyone deserves to be able to have that happen. The word accord, children's accord, we are shamelessly stealing the concept of the Paris Climate Accord, and which is looking to galvanize around global warming issues. And there was a successful effort to establish the metrics around reduction of carbon emission, a very practical. And there was also recognition that there are many strategies that could accomplish that, and that you had to unleash the innovation and creativity. And we were moving towards that. So the Children's Accord is thinking about how do we help young people through the developmental continuum, and it includes this North Star goal of enabling every child to achieve a post-secondary degree or credential, which really gives them access to opportunity and living wage jobs and the ability to contribute back to their community. And so like the Paris Climate Accord, this Children's Accord would really seek to codify and scale and sustainably fund the innovations like Elaine is talking about, the what works, to sustainably fund that over the long haul within communities. And again, in the absence of national leadership, the individuals that need to step into that void are local leaders, mayors, county executives, heads of school system, et cetera. And this emerging work recognizes that the infrastructure that currently invests in children and youth, it's vast, but it's really fragmented. And sadly, many communities, they don't even realize all of the assets that are within their communities, or the level of investment, or that correlation to return on investment. So the first step in a Children's Accord would really be around helping communities to get their arms around that kind of fact base.
And what about the small programs? We're running out of time, so I just want to get a couple of the questions.
Sure.
Who might feel threatened by this, who are doing God's work and they don't have a big budget, and you guys come in and they're afraid they might be pushed aside?
So I think the most important thing we say every community we go into is this work isn't about bringing prepackaged programs into your community. The first step is around really doing community asset mapping and recognizing, acknowledging the strengths of the programs that exist. Because often there are programs that are getting great outcomes, they just haven't been adequately resourced to scale and be sustained. So that has to be the first piece of it. National programs are great to fill gaps, but they can't push out the innovation and the great work that's happening within our communities right now.
Well, the bottom line is that there is hope out there, and it seems to be involving collaboration at this point. And as we said, this is a call of action to all of you here to get involved with these folks, to ask a lot of questions today, and to understand your role moving forward in terms of really collaborating to help children, particularly children of poverty, to succeed, because they deserve it. It's within reach, and it is, I think, Richard, you put it very well, and I can't remember the line you said. Do you remember? Oh, I do. It's nobody's fault, but everybody's responsibility.
Right.
That makes me now one of the most influential thinkers, doesn't it? Because I remembered it.
52.
I want to thank you guys. Marianne is actually sticking around, right? She's going to be at the Weiss Institute table, so go over and ask her all the questions you want. And you also have note cards on your table, so fill those out. Ask anything, and you can use the email address weissinstitute@sayyes-to-education.org. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Nicely done.
Good morning. Thank you, Meredith, and thank you to the panel. I'm Greg Behr, Executive Director of the Grable Foundation, and I stand before you with gratitude. As we endeavor to remake learning in Pittsburgh, I think about the incredible work that you're doing and what you're accomplishing on behalf of children and youth in Atlanta, Ayanna, in New England, Nick, in what you're accomplishing across this country, Karina, Laverne, Sanjeev, Itai. We are learning from you every day, and we are full of gratitude for what you do. If this were Romper Room, I wish I could take that mirror. Did anyone watch Romper Room? And truly cite the work that you each do because you inspire us with hope. I'm also incredibly honored to serve on the board of Grantmakers for Education. I work alongside some incredible board members, led by our board chair, Christina, our executive director, Anna, and the work that the staff and trustees do every day and every year to provoke tough questions, to help us improve what we do and to do it better. And it's encapsulated in that strategic vision identified by 3 words: together, what's next? Together, yes, we can do so much good in this world, especially for our children and youth. Mindful of what works and what we're learning about what works, with authentic respect, with boldness, with love. While our panel left the stage, would you please join me again in thanking all of them for reminding us of togetherness. We have another rich day ahead of us, and I hope you'll come together in this room later today at 4:15 as we see the creative brilliance of some young people in 2 organizations, Split This Rock and the DC Youth Orchestra, as we celebrate the arts as expressed by our young people. We're so grateful that they're here, and we hope that you'll join us for that moment. That'll be followed by some receptions, so use your conference app, see where you need to go to find your tribe, to connect on the issues about which you care, as together we move forward with what's next. And before you go, I'll just finish with a personal request. We don't talk often enough about love. I come from Pittsburgh, the hometown of Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers reminded us to put kids first, and to do so with love. And remember, he was a remarkable genius. He was a geek and innovator who saw what was attractive to those days kids and the newfangled technology of television, and made it attractive. So how do we embrace the future and do it mindful of child development theory and the whole child, and with love? And so today, but especially next week, I challenge us all to talk about our work and to talk about it in the context of love. And to do that publicly. We have got to change this country. We've got to bring love back to the fore, and each of us can do it. Thank you.